On today's show, I am joined by another member of the Cleveland Cavaliers injury report in the Chase Downs, Justin Rowan. We will be talking about the current state of the Cleveland Cavaliers, just the macro sense of what has happened this season, what to look ahead for with the remainder of the regular season and this upcoming weekend slate, and, just maybe what we anticipate come playoff time. Just be ready to check it out and hear more on today's Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Before we get started, I want to let you know that this episode of Locked On Cavs is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code in all lowercase LockedOnNBA for your first deposit match up to $100. As I had mentioned before, the Chase Downs Justin Rowan is joining me. Justin, how are you? I know I had teased you on being on the injury report, but how are you holding up, all things considered, this season?
All things considered, pretty good. Obviously, been laid up for about a month and a bit now with this torn Achilles. Only been outside a couple times. Mental health hanging on by a thread, but you know what? I'm getting through it. I'm beyond the halfway point and making some positive strides there. But definitely looking forward to gaining some mobility back, gaining the ability to just go outside for a walk. I guess if there's a time for this to occur, February is a great time in Winnipeg because it just sucks out there. But you know what? I'm doing pretty good. And last night's win over the Pelicans definitely helped get me in a better mood as well.
Yeah, it's a great lead in. And, I think also the fact that you are an injured member of the Cavs, but still dedicating all your time and energy to their work on the court is, podcasters are underappreciated, and hats off to you, Justin. But
yeah, it's the grind, but I'm pushing through it. I'm like Kobe at the free throw line.
I respect that. But so that's a great reference. Last night's win over the Pelicans was really impressive, and I think obviously there was just a big emotional boost from getting Donovan Mitchell back. I talked about it quite a bit on Locked On Cavs, for yesterday's episode, of course, and just really when looking at the grand scheme of it all, like this felt like a very complete, but also incomplete win, just because Donovan wasn't 100%. His shots weren't all going in, and he's putting up a lot of attempts. But you get a very good Darius Garland performance. You get a solid outing from George Niang. You get good production from pretty much everyone who gives you meaningful minutes. Even Damian Jones had like at least a Cavalier career game for himself. Like this was a good win, and I feel like a good palate cleanser just from a kind of bumpy stretch post All-Star break for the Cavs.
Yeah, I think it was honestly the first time that the offense really clicked since the All-Star break, and that's not really surprising when you've been down one of the guards. Competition not the greatest, but they just haven't looked themselves basically since the All-Star break. And even though Mitchell came back for a game or two there, he was obviously dealing with something that needed medical attention with that PRP injection. And I think just getting him back, it goes to show, the central thesis of this Cavs roster construction is that the two guards are going to make life easier for everybody when they're out on the court together. And I think we definitely saw that. I think Garland no longer getting double and triple teamed like he was through that stretch really kind of was a weight off of his shoulders. And when he's clicking, when Donovan's clicking, I just feel like Donovan was a whole lot better than his shooting percentages for the night and really did a good job making people better. And I think just his presence alone made it tough for a good defensive team in the Pelicans to really key in on any one individual.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think I'm going to take a lead off of you there. I agree, like when the guards are playing well, or at least when they're on the floor together, they're so dynamic and hard for opposing defenses to really pay full attention to and contain. But for me, I agree, Garland had a lot of weight put on his shoulders when Donovan went down after the PRP injections for a handful of games, and he admitted post-game that he's still not 100% physically post-jaw surgery, whether it's weight or conditioning or just kind of, trusting his body and, the beatings he's going to get. He's got hit in the face quite a bit. And I'm sure that's, bit of a system shock, just no matter what. I mean, the same goes for when he gets poked in the eye. He constantly got hit in the face constantly after that. But it just felt last night like though both of those guys made each other's games easier, and it's nice to see them working in harmony when there have been some bumps at times, or just like they've been in and out of the lineup, just because like 10,000 feet above this team, like up to this point, like the consistent theme for this team is one guy comes back, two guys come out, and injuries have just kind of, I don't want to say robbed us, just because they are still the second best or third best team in the Eastern Conference, depending on how you feel, but kind of like doesn't allow us to get a full gauge of what this team could potentially be.
Yeah, honestly, I do feel like, and this is, you know, a more emotional approach than I think an analytical one, because by an analytical standpoint, the Cavs have had more success than they did last year. They're likely going to finish with more wins than they did last year. I think they had the inside track of being the 2 seed. But from an emotional standpoint, there was a hangover coming off of that Knicks series. And we had to wait so long for catharsis, right? Like Jared Allen misses right at the start of the season with the foot issue. Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland both dealing with hamstring injuries. Garland had that shooting hand issue that was bothering him forever, where he's, holding his hand almost every game or playing with a wrap some nights. Like there were just so many things earlier in that season that screwed up the context. And when Garland and Mobley went down, I believe their third most used lineup had maybe 38 minutes together. Like I think it was below either 40 or 50 minutes. And part of that kind of magical stretch that the Cavs had there was with a lot of roster continuity. You finally had the same guys out there every single night. Obviously, the competition was a little slower. And then you get that stretch back where Garland and Mobley first return. And sometimes I think people forget that 18-2 stretch. 9-1 of that came with Garland and Mobley back on the minutes restriction, and the offense and defense had improved at that time. And we go into the All-Star break saying, you know what? Finally, they're going to be coming off the minutes restriction. We're going to get a little bit of a groove. We'll be able to, assess this team a little bit better. And then, similar to 2 years ago, coming out of the All-Star break, Mitchell's out. LeVert's out, just like Garland and LeVert were out back then. Uneven performances, not really playing down to the level of the competition at some times, and then, just trying to rediscover that groove. So I understand why fans feel like this has been, a frustrating or incomplete season, because even from an analysis standpoint, I think this is one of the tougher seasons for me to break down on what's going on and how good this team truly is.
Yeah, it's really is hard to give a full autopsy. Even up to this point, even when this season wraps, I think I will struggle with the fact that there's just a lot of just stuff that was out of Cleveland's control, a lot of freak accidents and injuries and things that just were completely out of their control, and it's going to be tough to evaluate, but I do think it is commendable. Like you said, from an emotional aspect at least, they didn't really falter. I remember when the news broke that Darius and Evan would be out, it was mid-December. They were off 2 ugly losses against the Celtics, pretty frustrating losses, I'd say, too. And I thought, okay, this team could be at a crossroads where they're dramatically different. Maybe JB's not the coach anymore. Maybe the Cavs make a trade to, shake things up a little bit. I have to give credit where credit's due. JB Bickerstaff has full command and attention to that locker room. Everyone is willing to go to war and play for him, and like you said, the continuity helped quite a bit, but I also just think the fact that there is that internal belief that this team will be fine no matter who is or isn't available is really commendable. And yeah, sure, there are moments post All-Star break where perhaps they played down. I wonder if fatigue maybe played a factor too, just because they're so thin at certain spots that you're overplaying people, just because it's the nature of the beast. But it is just, to me, still regardless. I'm yeah, this Cavs team showed a lot of heart, and they're showing a lot of grit that maybe people certainly would question post playoff run last year against New York.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, I still my kind of gut feeling with this team is that they do have a tendency to play down a competition. I mean, you look back at the Warriors loss last year when all the starters were out, even that recent Knicks loss, that Knicks loss, I understand that people are going to have concerns with the Knicks, but if they lose a potential series against the Knicks in the future, I don't think anything we learned in that game came from that. I think it was simply they were down all their guys and the Cavs took their foot off the gas. You look at Cleveland's record against teams 500 and above, it's 17-19. But within that, you have a loss to the Knicks without the Knicks, basically. You have 2 losses to the Sixers without Embiid, where I just don't think the Cavs had a great effort. And you have a loss to Miami, where Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo were out of the lineup. Or maybe it was Hero, no, Jimmy. I forget who they were missing. But they were missing guys, right?
And I think it was Bam. No, Bam played, Jimmy and Hero were out. But either way, they were missing key guys. And this is a team that just made the NBA Finals.
And if you take those games, like if the Cavs just gave like the effort that we have seen against some of the top teams in the league in those games, all of a sudden that 17-19 record is now 21-15. You feel so much better about how they're doing. And I think that's more reflective of how good they actually have been as a team without those letdown games. But, you know, whatever the reason is, it's been a Rorschach test, right? Like, I think if you have enough data points on each side to either be very optimistic or very concerned. And, you know, I don't think there's one true answer of how good the Cavs are. And frankly, like that's probably true of all teams. It's going to come down to how well they execute, how well they learn from the mistakes they're inevitably going to make in a playoff series. And I'm just really interested to see with this remaining stretch, as well as the playoff run that they're going to try to go on, how, you know, they do that problem solving and what adjustments get made.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see. And I agree, like in the macro sense of it all, I know that I let in saying we're going to discuss this a little bit, but it is kind of hard to get a full litmus test of what this team is, just because there are technicalities and points that come with some of those losses. And then it's just hard to figure out where they stand. Like record wise and statistically speaking, they are one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, but like it just sometimes depends on the matchup. And you did make a valid point with the Warriors loss. I think the Portland lost early on in the season is another good example of that. Just like a very bad team. The Cavs just came out lifeless, and the Blazers smelled blood in the water and just never relented. So I think that is a valid point. I agree with you on that. But let's talk more about the remainder of the season, even though it is a bit of that grind towards, you know, just the lead up to the playoffs. And I think the Cavs are locked in, but we can certainly just kind of give our thoughts on the remainder of the year, because there are some tough opponents coming up for the Cavs. But let's just get a quick word in from our sponsors before we do that. Today's episode of Locked On Cavs, like I mentioned at the top, is sponsored by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is North America's largest daily fantasy sports platform. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS, daily fantasy sports, and it's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players and having to deal with pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than 2 to 6 player stat projections and just let the winnings roll in. Personally, Prize Picks is the most fun I've ever had, winning up to 25% or 25 times, my money this basketball season. All I had to do is select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and I placed my entry. Testing my skills on Prize Picks this basketball season is the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. With these skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few quick taps. Prize Picks is simple to play. I can make my picks and submit an entry in less than 60 seconds, and it offers quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types, making the Prize Picks app the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Prize Picks offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday each Tuesday. Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value. Prize Picks now offers Apple Pay for quick and easy withdrawals and deposits, and you can get in the action much sooner. So, check out Prize Picks today. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for the first deposit match of up to $100. Again, go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100 and daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, we are back. Justin, just looking ahead to this upcoming stretch. I mean, let's dive in first. Just they play Houston on Saturday, and then they play the Pacers on Monday. I think those are 2 very interesting matchups for the Cavs, just because the Rockets are just, in my opinion, at least a collective tryhards. I think they're a little better than their record can lead on, depending on how you catch them that night. And then the Pacers are just weirdly a team that has Cleveland's number. But who do you want to start with on just like looking ahead to this upcoming weekend slate?
To me, the Pacers are more interesting. I think you're right about Houston, but obviously with the injury to Alperen Şengün, that does kind of take some steam out of that matchup. I think that was one that you'd have circled if it was Mobley versus Şengün, just because, two phenomenal big men. But that Indy game to me is the most interesting because, as you mentioned, they've struggled a little bit against them this year. Again, it falls into that category of, and there's a whole lot of context there. Like the first game, there was no Garland, Mitchell, and Allen, I believe. And then the second game against them was the first game back for both Darius and Jarrett, and minute restriction and working your way back from that hamstring injury. So that there was weird context to both of those games. But it's such a significant game for multiple reasons because, one, it's a potential first-round matchup, depending on where the Cavs end up in the standings. You want to start to get some of those data points about how you match up to them. What are the pain points? Where do the Cavs have to make adjustments? And the other aspect of it is if you win that game, you clinch the tiebreaker against the Milwaukee Bucks, which I think is obviously really important when the Cavs are going in, it's going to be a tough schedule down the stretch. It's going to be a fight for that 2 seed throughout the whole process. Getting that feather in your cap where you have that tiebreaker, I think, would be incredibly significant. They're going to have 2 chances to do that against the Pacers, but I think if you can get that early on, you start to feel a whole lot better.
Yeah, and I think also if you just maybe solve the puzzle and, like you said, get those data points on what does or doesn't work, albeit with the fact that there likely will be no Evan Mobley in this matchup just based on what's reported and just, being realistic about ankle sprains for big men and just, not wanting to rush him back to the floor in any way, shape, or form. Like, Jared Allen is going to have a tough task against Miles Turner no matter how you shake it. I think the Pacers are just such an interesting matchup for the Cavs because, like, Halliburton is a constant threat. Then you have Nembhard, who's also scary. Like, Nesmith, Siakam is a huge move for them, and it's kind of worked out pretty nicely for them, I'd say. Like, they have an overabundance of just depth at almost like every position. Like, they took Jarris Walker with like a top 10 pick this year, and he hardly plays for the Pacers, excuse me. And like, either he's a trade chip to make the Pacers better, or he just becomes a monster that's slowly marinating off the bench for them. But to your point, as we record this, we're recording this on Thursday evening. Cleveland and Milwaukee are currently tied at 42 and 24. Cleveland is ahead of them right now in the actual like metaphysical standings for 2 and 3. But yeah, every game is going to count down the stretch just because despite the Cavs kind of bouncing back very cleanly against Milwaukee and Joe Prunty's last game as interim head coach, the Bucks are starting to kind of figure it out a little bit under Doc Rivers. Like, sure, they had a very one-note performance the other night, but like Dame and Giannis are starting to click really well, and I think like you can afford to maybe take some of these games off, which can be a little unfortunate if you're Cleveland because you're already so banged up and playing so many guys so many minutes that you want to try and at least get to the postseason as healthy as possible. So yeah, I think this Pacers matchup is fascinating, and it could really change the dichotomy of the rest of this regular season if the Cavs just lock it up then.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not as concerned about, wear and tear. I feel like the Cavs have been relatively careful with guys and bringing back too soon.
I agree, but it's just, you don't want to run everyone else into the ground either because you're missing so many guys. So.
Right, but my point is, if someone got into that situation, I think it would be similar to like, Max Strus, where you eventually get pulled and like you have the depth to kind of absorb that. Like, I don't think that the Cavs necessarily are going to need to be playing a playoff rotation down the stretch, but I do think that there is a benefit to playing so many meaningful games down the stretch because you look at the last 3 years basically of the post All-Star break. There's been context to it. Like, I mentioned the injuries after the All-Star break in Cleveland where you lose Garland, you lose Wade, you lose Allen, you lose Mobley, you lose LeVert. Like, that was obviously a big part of it, and there was a lot of injuries the year prior. And then last year, even though the winning percentage was the same, there wasn't the same kind of statement wins. They kind of won the ones that they were supposed to win. They had a good win in Miami, and then I think Garland missed the second game of that kind of 2 games in Miami there, but just wasn't a lot of real quality wins. And I think it's important for the Cavs to still be playing for something at this time of year, to be problem solving because they haven't had time together. Yeah. And Garland and Mitchell in particular, they need to first get back to the chemistry that they had last season, because I think this year's been a little more your turn, my turn, and just them not being in a rhythm compared to where they were last year. You got to get back to that place, and then you got to build upon that to, for Garland to take another step as an off-ball player, to maximize Mitchell's growth as a playmaker this season. I think you need to get as many meaningful reps between those two, problem solving and elevating their games together as you possibly can, because that's going to pay dividends in the playoffs. And like the reality is, once you get to the postseason, you're going to have 7-8 days off because of the play-in tournament now, right? Like you're going to have that time to rest and recover. So make the most of this time. Get into kind of that playoff shape. Shake off that rust. Try to do some problem solving. Hopefully, Mobley is back at some point. I mean, let's blame the Achilles, but it's taken me out of my view as a typical optimist. I'm just like, God, I hope he's back for the playoffs. But if you do get some regular season time with him back, use that time to figure out that fit, right, and get him reintegrated. So I do think that there can be a benefit to being in this tight standings race.
I can understand that, and to maybe rewind a little bit, like looking at this Pelicans win, I think, sure, Mitchell was 5-16. You and I are both on the same page where he kind of set the tone emotionally, making those 2 3-pointers and having a block on the other end to start the game. Like that's just a really good way to set the tone and also give that proverbial emotional shot in the arm to say like, okay, like our quote unquote best player leader is back. But you look at the stats, like Garland took a healthy volume of 3-pointers in this game. He was 10-16. I mean, 60% of his makes came from the perimeter. Mitchell had 5 assists in this game. Garland had 27 and 11 overall. Mitchell 14, 5 and 4. This, and Garland had 6 rebounds too. Don't want to diminish that, but I think that is a good template. And I agree, like it is a lot of your turn, my turn. It was actually kind of surprising to me that it felt like the chemistry that was almost instantaneous last year has kind of vanished a little bit. But I do wonder if just injuries have played a huge part in that, just because like Garland isn't still 100%. I think Mitchell is going to have to work his way back a little bit. Like a PRP injection in your knee is a pretty hefty procedure, and I'm beyond impressed. Like we were talking about modern medicine before we came on. Like modern medicine worked its magic on Donovan Mitchell's knee, and you hope it remains ship-shape going forward. But I think just looking at that Pelicans game, like that's a good template for it. And if you can continue to keep building on that and just kind of figuring out and picking and choosing the shots between them, like it makes it easier for those two. And then at least playing like meaningful basketball down the stretch. Like, yes, they play the Pacers on Monday, then they come home to possibly see Kevin Love in Cleveland in a Heat uniform for the first time. And then they go on the road to play the Timberwolves and the Heat, and then they get a little bit of a breather against the Hornets, and then they play the Sixers, the Nuggets, the Jazz, the Suns, the Lakers, the Clippers. I'm just listing the rest of their schedule. Then you get a bit more of a breather against the banged up Grizzlies. Then you play the Pacers one more time, and then you wrap it up against the Hornets at home for the 82nd game of the season, which could be, like a career night for Isaiah Mobley or something like that. If you really want to rest, if you're able to afford to rest your guys at that point, it could be an interesting stretch. But I think like
the Imani Bates masterclass.
Yeah, it's going to be a stretch at least where it's not just the fact that, because you are making a lot of sense as we discuss this and maybe debate it a bit, just because of the degree of the opponent. Like, yeah, there are some softer matchups throughout that are sprinkled, but like the defending NBA champs are still on the docket and they're playing great basketball. You have the Eastern Conference champion from last season twice still on your docket. You have the number one defense that you dismantled the other night in the Timberwolves, who may be looking to kind of mix things up too. Like, these are good gut check games, and also like they could be a good like adjustment depending on how healthy this team is during these matchups to kind of get them more acquainted to the grind of the postseason.
Yeah, and those ones against Miami, like the 5 that I have circled are the 2 Pacers games, the 2 games against Miami, and the game against Philly. Who knows? Maybe Joel Embiid's back at that point. We'll find out. But those are all teams that the Cavs could realistically be playing in the first round. And I think what we saw last year in the regular season sample against the Knicks, it was a weird one. Like, Garland missed a matchup. Allen missed 2 matchups. Like, there was always some sort of weird context, but there were still things within those individual matchups where, you look at it and it's, who did the Cavs have their worst O rating against all season? It was the Knicks. Who did they really struggle on the defensive glass against? It was the Knicks, right? Like, there was little breadcrumbs within it. And I think people sometimes dismiss the regular season as not being meaningful. It is. It's not meaningful on like a very surface level, if you're just like doing a national podcast, you're talking about 30 teams, you're talking about the larger narratives of the league, and then you look at your win-loss record. When you're in like today's NBA, which I think is more, it resembles the NBA that I grew up watching, where there was a little bit more parity and there was a lot of teams that were competitive and it came down to matchups. Those regular season matchups can be indicative. There can be things when you're looking closely that can be instructive of, like I said, pain points and things that you can learn prior to a playoff series. So that's what I'm going to be looking for. I'm interested to see what they do defensively against the Pacers, because if as elite as the Cavs are defensively, I do sometimes have questions about how their defense holds up and how their communication is against stretch bigs. Mm-hmm. That's going to be interesting against the Miles Turner, right? Like or how do they handle the pace that the Pacers play at, right? Do they slow things down and get back into some of their bad habits in the clutch if it's a tight game because they're scared of the Pacers going out and running? Or does it resemble when they beat the Kings at home where Sacramento is running? Screw it. We're going at our pace too. We're still going, full bars offensively. We're still going to give it to them because we have confidence in our offense and what we're running, and we're just going to play our style and not be scared that you're going to come back in this one. Those are the type of questions that I really want to find out, and those are the type of things that I think you can still learn from this regular season.
I agree, and I think there are going to be more questions than I think answers just because of the lack of availability for certain guys. Like the Max Strus injury is tough. The Evan Mobley injury is even tougher just because he was playing so well pre-All-Star break, and then kind of like the rest of the team is a little flat post-All-Star break, and it's just been bumpy now with the injury. It's tough. It's been an unfortunate third season for him just because of things that were kind of out of his control, just within the general flow of basketball. But let's take another quick break for ads, and I'm going to actually fire a few more questions your way as we get on out of here.
Right on.
Today's episode of Locked On Cavs is also brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood is the IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from another retirement account with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to the IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good now through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees applies, and of course, I also have to give you some legal info. You can claim this as a Q1 2024 validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. A 3% match requires Robinhood Gold from 1 year from the date of the 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years, and the 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA is available to U.S. customers with good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. All right, after that mouthful of letters at the end there, Justin, my question for you is, who do you think is going to be one of the bigger X factors heading into this final stretch and in the early beginnings of the postseason? Like you noted, 7-8 games off because of the play-in tournament. Cleveland could get an extra day depending on maybe where they fall and how the NBA structures the scheduling for just the first round of the playoffs. But whether it's a star like Garland, Mitchell, Allen, Mobley, or even one of the role players who I think have been really standing up and standing out, like Niang, Okoro, Strus, etc. It also depends on health, of course, but like who are you kind of like keeping an eye on just as the postseason looms, because they could be an impact player come playoff time?
Yeah, I'm not going to go hipster with this and name a role player. I think it has to be Darius. I think what Donovan has done this season from an improvement standpoint, I'm blown away by it. Like I think he's grown so much as a playmaker. I think he's grown as a defender. He's really rounded out into a hell of a player. And I think what makes the Cavs their most dynamic is when both of the guards are clicking. And for Darius, doing the season preview, I didn't predict, and it's funny coming from me again, the optimist here. I didn't think that this was going to be a Mobley leap year. I thought we were going to see steady improvement, but I didn't necessarily think that there was going to be some seismic leap in his offensive game. Now, he's averaging career best in every single category, so the improvement's been there. But I thought that this was going to be the leap year for Darius, where all of a sudden the 3-point volume goes up, and that just changes the math on how you have to play the Cavs. Because you look back to that playoff series against the Knicks, like game 1, Knicks are going under every single time, and he just wasn't taking those shots. In game 2, all of a sudden he's aggressive and completely changes that game. Game 3 was one of the worst games, but he bounced back from that, and in game 4, like almost won the Cavs that game if Evan Mobley doesn't get into foul trouble. I think if Darius takes that step forward and is a high volume player that can play on and off ball, he and Mitchell just become those dueling banjos where it's either one of them can be initiating. It keeps the defense guessing. Jared Allen and Evan Mobley have shown so much growth as short roll playmakers as well, that if those two hubs are clicking at a high level on and off ball, and you have the supplemental playmaking around them, and you have the shooters around them, all of a sudden this is a Cavs offense that can, put a scare into just about anybody and can go as far as their execution will take.
I think that's a great pick just in terms of the star guys. I think Garland it's been a weird season for him overall. I think the Evan Mobley leap is a fair question too, just because I think everyone rightfully was very high on Evan Mobley, and I just think injuries have kind of kept us from getting a full perspective, and we've gotten still those little teases of what he can be, but it's just been a tough year to evaluate this team, as you and I noted in the first segment, but I'll go the hipster route. I think it's going to be Isaac Okoro, who has just been absolutely awesome for the Cavs. I think he's been a guy who has been incredibly consistent despite all the injuries Cleveland's dealing with, whether he's starting, coming off the bench. He's giving you elite point of attack defense. He's an awesome help defender. He is really thriving in kind of this faster offensive approach the Cavs are trying to maintain at times, just whether it's getting on the fast break. But more impressively, like if he is on the perimeter and a defense sags off of him, he doesn't shy away and try to jive for the basket anymore. He just rips the three. And then you see games where he maybe goes like 1 for 5 or 1 for 6 or something like that. And some people may moan about that, but to me, I'm thinking like, no, he's at least showing confidence in trying to maybe find a bit of a rhythm, because that's what shooting ultimately is just finding a rhythm. It's just, that's how it works in basketball. But if you help him find his stride, like that's great. And if he has confidence, that's even better, just because I think back to last season, Okoro hits that game winner against the Nets. It's obviously the highest of highs during that season for him personally, and I think one of the highlights of the Cleveland's season last year. But he then has that injury against the Rockets. He's out for almost a month, and then he gets thrown right back into the fire against the playoffs. And he's pretty cold and rusty on offense, and the Knicks are able to kind of exploit that matchup a little bit, where you're only getting one layer of attack from Okoro, where if he's confident, feeling himself, and knock on wood, is able to stay healthy, like he could be an X factor for Cleveland, just because he is very comfortable defending multiple positions and also just locking up the opposing perimeter player.
Yeah, I think Okoro's a great pick, and I've comped him. I mean, it was a draft comp for him, but it's kind of funny to look at what he's done this season and think, oh, this is actually a guy that takes and makes more threes than Andre Iguodala did during those Warriors years, like coming in off the bench. And I feel like he's someone that can be that connective glue, just like Andre Iguodala was, where, even though he's coming in off the bench, there might be nights where he's closing, whether that's over Max Strus, whether that's over one of the bigs, whether that's over the guards. Like, it's going to be, merit-based and based on matchups. But he's someone that really changes things. I think the steps that he's taken this year as a guy that's only, 2-3 months older than Evan Mobley, like, there's still a lot ahead for him. Like, he is someone that can make a big difference. And the volume 3-point shooting is by far the most exciting thing for him. Like, he's taking 7-8 threes a game when he's getting the minutes, and he's not afraid to take contested ones, and that's opening up his playmaking and all that. Like, he's a guy that can change a playoff series. When you have a core forward that, when they're all together, plays so damn well on both ends of the court, having that fifth guy that you can cycle in just gives the Cavs a wealth of options. And, Karras has played great. Max has played great. There's a lot of different ways that you can go, but having a dynamic two-way player like Isaac Okoro, who has gone from kind of one of the more maligned players in the fan base to, I think, like, if my mentions are any indication, of like a fan favorite this year. Like, people love what he's brought.
Yeah, and I think rightfully so. And I think it's the cool, calm, and collected confidence he has too. Like he knows he's the baddest dude on defense, and like he lets his play speak for itself, and he'll quietly say like, "Listen, I locked that dude up tonight," or "Sure, maybe this guy busted me, but like I still made it really hard from every possession." Like Damian Lillard, I still laugh about it. It's similar to like LeBron watching Kawhi Leonard check in during the NBA Finals back when LeBron was at the Heat. Like Damian Lillard like was living rent free in Isaac Okoro's head for the longest time, or Isaac
Yeah.
Okoro rather was living rent free in Damian Lillard's head for the longest time. Still very well may be, and that could be an interesting thing come playoff time. But my last lightning round question is, as we head out of here, we talked about the Pacers quite a bit and how they're pesky, and I think they could be a very interesting playoff matchup for Cleveland, but I think there's another team that could kind of throw a wrench at them. So if you had to pick between the Orlando Magic and the Indiana Pacers, who would you rather face in the first round if you were the Cavs personally?
Orlando.
Interesting.
Just from like I know they're big and physical, but I just think that they don't have the ability to keep up with the Cavs offensively. Like I think the Cavs can slow them down. Like Cleveland's the better defense,
Yeah.
and they have more experience at this point. They'd have the best player, or maybe even players in that series, as great as Paolo Banchero is. I'd go with that because Indiana, like Tyrese Halliburton, when he's at his best, has a case for best guard in the NBA, or at least best point guard in the NBA. Pascal Siakam can be a pest and get Mobley in foul trouble. As I mentioned, sometimes the stretch bigs can warp a Cavs defense, so Miles Turner can be deadly. They've got depth as shooters. Like I just don't think like Orlando has the defensive and rebounding capabilities to be a pest and be annoying and be a tough out. But I feel like from a high end upside standpoint, the Pacers would scare me a little bit more.
I think I partially agree just because the Cavs split the season series with the Magic, but it's also hard to gauge just because Cleveland wasn't fully healthy in some of those matchups, and neither was Orlando for some too. And I think they have just the length and maybe just like the youth and overwhelming depth to maybe push the Cavs a little bit. But I'm not saying like Cleveland's in big trouble if they drew the Magic in the first round, but like it could be just like a frustrating series for them as they want to get out of this first round matchup and possibly collide with the Knicks in the second round, which would be, must see TV for everyone and probably heart attack inducing for this fan base and the Knicks fan base. But I overall in the broad spectrum, I just think and it could change a lot based on how Monday's matchup goes, especially if Cleveland remains undermanned. But I think Indiana is just the team you probably want to avoid the most if you're the Cavs in the first round, just because like they are a team that just throws a lot of different wrinkles at you. And like you said, it's Halliburton. When Halliburton's on his A game, like he is damn near unstoppable just on the floor. And like,
I
yeah, you'd
assume
imagine.
Miami is ahead of them. Like when you talk about possible pests, because like even right
Yeah,
now, like Miami would be the 8 seed and potentially 7 seed if they win that play-in matchup.
fair
So
enough.
if you're throwing Miami and Philly into that mix, like turning the question back to you, where would you rank those four? Because I think all four are very much in play.
Yeah, I think all four are very much in play. I think the Heat are just so hard to evaluate because they're a zombie team. But right now, it would be, I guess, based on the current standings, would it be Indiana, Miami, Chicago, Atlanta? So, and then Philly's the sixth seed. Indiana's the seventh seed currently. So it'd be like that mix up. Like Atlanta, if they somehow walk the way into the playoffs and they won and ended up the seventh seed, the Cavs are just licking their chops at that point, just because that team
That'd be ideal.
it's a mess. That team's a mess. Miami would be really tough just because like you have Jimmy Butler, you have Bam Adebayo, and you also have just like the tactical acumen of Eric Spoelstra, who is, at least in my opinion, one of the best, if not the best coach in the NBA. So if I had to rank those four, it'd probably be Indiana still one in terms of like least ideal to most ideal. Indiana one, Miami two. I think Chicago three, just because they threw that weird wrinkle and they're just objectively better than the Hawks in my opinion. And then Atlanta like a very distant fourth. Like you're thinking, okay, this is a bit of a breather and ease in round, especially for a Cavs team that still might be trying to find itself a little bit come playoff time, even with the luxury of 7-8 days off and a couple practices under their belt.
Yeah. I would not put India above Miami. This is going to be sick, but I welcome a Miami first round matchup. I think that would be the toughest opponent by far. But from a changing perception standpoint, I don't think that there is any first round matchup win that the Cavs would have that would change the way people feel about them and people would rate more than beating the Miami Heat just because they have been to the finals so many times. Spo is the best coach in the NBA, in my opinion. I think if you beat Indiana, if you beat Orlando, if you beat Chicago, if you beat Philly without Joel Embiid, you did what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. Miami, I think almost everybody would pick the Heat, even though Cleveland's been the better team this season. I would pick Cleveland. I think we can beat them. I don't think that it's been a tough matchup. But again, that goes to what we were talking about earlier in this podcast. I'm really interested to see how those two matchups go next week.
Yeah, no, I think we'll get a better idea. At least, again, the playoffs aren't fully the same as the regular season. But like you said, you get data points, you get understandings, you get kind of just you can kind of piece together the series, especially if you're a little bit more tuned in, and especially if you listen to Locked On Cavs or the Chase Down, just get a better understanding of how the Cavs match up specifically, because it's a Cleveland focused podcast from both of our sides. So we get a better idea of, or the fans at least get a better idea of it. So yeah, we'll see how these upcoming matchups go. But Justin, I really appreciate your time, my man. Do you have anything you want to plug on your way out? I mean, I'm sure people already know who you are. You are the El Presidente of
you never
Cavs
podcast. You never want to make assumptions about that sort of thing. Yeah, you can find me on Chase Down Podcast wherever you got this podcast. You can find us there. We go live post game or twice a week on the Cavs YouTube channel as long as Carter's around. I don't know how to do that techie stuff, so if he's not, I'm getting someone else to fill in, and we are doing it in post. Thank you so much, Evan, for having me on. It's good to talk Cavs with someone other than Carter. I could think of him.
It's been long overdue since we had a crossover. So yeah, we'll do it again as often as we can. But folks, I'm Evan. That's Justin. Check out the Chase Down after listening to Locked On Cavs, or if you're listening to the Chase Down, hopefully you're listening to Locked On Cavs after. But until next time, I think Chris will be back Saturday after the Cavs-Rockets game when they play at 5 p.m. Eastern. But until then, like I said, I'm Evan. That's Justin. See you next time.